The gentleman yields back. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee print offered by Mr. Nadler of New York.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I will now recognize myself to explain the amendment. The changes in this amendment are technical in nature or necessary to clarify the intent of the underlying legislation. For example, in the first section, we changed a reference from at least 2 years to not less than 2 years to be consistent with similar language in that section. All other changes are contained in the second section. Because of the complex framework of our immigration visa system, these changes are necessary to ensure that the Department of State and the Department of Homeland Security do not interpret our language to permit double counting of visas. This new language makes it clear that only visas that have not been previously allocated to any immigrant can be recaptured and allocated. All the changes made in the amendment are minor and improve on a good bill. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
No, Mr. Chairman.
For what purposes does Mr. McClintock seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee print offered by Mr. McClintock of California. Page 17.
The amendment is considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment prohibits the Justice Department from discriminating against businesses and other entities receiving federal funds because they reject Mr. Biden's vaccine dictate. Mr. Biden said this is not about freedom, this is about your safety. Benjamin Franklin had a decidedly different view, an authentically American view, that those that give up freedom for safety deserve neither. This is very much a question of freedom and a question of an authoritarian government that is aggressively, unconstitutionally, and now belligerently asserting control over every facet of Americans' lives, including what medical procedures they must undergo. The COVID vaccine is a miracle of American research and development, made possible after President Trump cut through miles of red tape, mountains of bureaucracy, and restored to pharmaceutical companies the freedom to innovate. And the data is clear that the vaccine is effective at dramatically reducing the severity of the illness and especially the risk of dying from it. Every American has been informed of this, and every American has had the opportunity to protect themselves by being vaccinated. Now, after looking at the data and considering my own circumstances, I gladly got the vaccine. One less thing to worry about. But if I had already recovered from COVID, as at least 41 million Americans have, I might have concluded otherwise. Multiple studies document that natural immunity is more effective at protecting against a second infection than the vaccine. If I were under 20, I might have concluded otherwise. A study out of Israel warns that for young males, the risk of myocarditis from the vaccine is greater than the risk of hospitalization for COVID. Mr. Biden is correct that the current COVID spike is very much an epidemic of the unvaccinated, which raises the question, who exactly are we protecting? We've been told if you're vaccinated, you're protected. The only significant risk is to the unvaccinated who've already assessed the risks for themselves and accepted those risks for themselves. The studies are clear that if you're vaccinated, you've got a higher risk of dying from the flu. If you're under 20 and unvaccinated, you have a higher risk of dying from the flu. So in this brave new world of Big Brother Biden, what is to stop the government from forcing every American to get a flu shot, or a tetanus shot, or a hepatitis shot, or a shingles shot? The president warns his patience is wearing thin. Well, Mr. Biden, our patience as Americans is wearing thin. We are tired of being bullied by autocrats, zealots, and petty tyrants who've robbed our children of their educations and robbed millions of Americans of their livelihoods. Study after study now documents that there is no statistically significant difference in the spread of the virus between jurisdictions that mandated business closures, house detentions, and mask wearing, and those that did not. Sweden never mandated any of those things, and they have an older and therefore more vulnerable population than ours. As of this morning, Sweden had 593 fewer deaths per million from COVID than the United States. That is to say, if we had Sweden's numbers, there would be 195,000 fewer dead Americans from COVID. I'm more than happy to listen to my government's advice on how to live my life, but I'll be damned if I'll take its orders. In the case of the vaccines, for me and my family, that advice made sense. Others may conclude otherwise. I am vaccinated, so the unvaccinated pose no threat to me. The threat they pose to themselves is their responsibility. It is none of my business, it is none of your business, and it is certainly none of Joe Biden's business. A government that has seized the power to order you to submit to medical procedures against your physician's advice and your own best judgment is a government that has no boundaries left. Every day, people make bad decisions in their lives. But the bad decisions we all make are the price we pay for the freedom to make all the good decisions in our lives. Our government is based on the notion that we are born with the right to live our lives as we see fit, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That government does not create these rights, but rather we create government to protect them. Any form of government that becomes destructive of them renounces its legitimacy and absolves its citizens from loyalty or obedience. That is what is at stake here. Everything that defines us as a free people, everything that defines us as Americans. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, although I thought this was not germane, I'm advised that the parliamentarian thinks it is, so I withdraw my point of order.
Chairman. Strike the last word. I'll just be brief and state what is obvious. We don't have any text yet from the President on this order, but it has raised a lot of alarm around the country. I'm sure that many of my colleagues here today would attest to the fact that our phones began to melt down when the President came out with this unprecedented overreach, this order where he claims to have power over private employers with 100 or more employees. That affects many, many hardworking Americans and small business owners in every district in America. Our ranking member, Jim Jordan, said so well at the opening of this hearing that the main job of the Judiciary Committee in the House is to protect the freedom of Americans. And as the alarms are being raised by our constituents, we ought to be raising the alarms as well. We should be asking some very pertinent questions, as Tom has alluded to here. Where is the authority to do this? The President appears to be trying to squeeze this under some sort of statutory authority or rulemaking authority of OSHA, but this would be an unprecedented overreach. And there are many legal scholars around the country right now deliberating, scratching their heads over what in the world the President is trying to do. I'm going to state something else that I think is obvious. I think the President took this dramatic step because he wanted to change the narrative. I mean, I think that he was getting a lot of, just attention for the disaster that was the Afghanistan withdrawal and all the border and all these other issues that are plaguing this administration and the American people. And I think he just lobbed the equivalent of a Hail Mary pass into the middle of this and issued this order that he probably, at least his administration, knows is not constitutional and won't be upheld in court. But he was successful, at least over the weekend, in changing the narrative and having people panic about yet another Biden-created disaster. So I'm speaking up on behalf of my constituents who have asked me, pleaded with me to do so. I hope that all of our colleagues will do. I support this amendment because it's important, and I think we need to be doing everything we can on this committee and on the House floor and in every opportunity we have in Congress to, as Jim said, to protect the liberties of the American people, because they are in jeopardy right now more than they've ever been. I'll yield to Ms. Jordan.
I would just, I think the gentleman, he's right on target. And I would just say, you know who else agrees with you and your constituents? At least he used to. Joe Biden,
Right.
December 2020, I don't think vaccines should be mandatory. I wouldn't demand it be mandatory. So deep down, even the President of the United States knows this isn't going to fly constitutional. There's no way this is going to fly. But he's engaged in doing exactly what the gentleman from Louisiana described, trying to change the narrative. He knows deep down. Dr. Fauci said the same thing. The all-knowing Reverend Fauci said the same thing. He doesn't think vaccines should be mandatory. Suddenly he changes his position. So I think everyone knows this is unconstitutional. And this committee, as the gentleman pointed out, should stand up and say, we're not going to tolerate this is a good amendment. I hope we adopt it. I yield back.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman,
What purpose does the gentlelady from Texas?
Strike the last word. It amazes me that our colleagues have been particularly concerned about violence. We are now presenting a solution that responds to the outcry of violence throughout America, particularly gun violence. And they want to utilize a completely contrary amendment that premise stands on disregarding an executive order by the President of the United States under a national emergency that is attempting to ensure the health safety of the American people. If that isn't contrary to what my colleagues seem to represent, law and order, I don't know what is. President Biden's order deals with issues of safety and security and health care, and there is nothing in this legislation that suggests any discrimination would take place, and so I have to oppose this amendment because I believe it is not timely, it is unnecessary, and it contravenes the general commitment to ending community violence, and as well, it contravenes the President's responsibility as both Commander-in-Chief and dealing with a national ongoing pandemic to provide the tools to safeguard the American people, to make them healthy, to ensure that we can get back to the life we've known and loved. For that reason, I think this amendment should be opposed, and I oppose the amendment. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. What purpose does Mr. Massey seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Massey is recognized.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Joe Biden's mandate is illegal, unscientific, and hurtful. And I want to start out with the illegal part of it. The president knows he doesn't have the authority to force somebody to take a vaccine. We all know that he does not have that authority. What he's trying to do is to convolute the situation by inserting an administrative agency and an employer between himself and the person he is trying to force to take the vaccine. He does not have this authority, and inserting an agency between him and the people who are being forced to take it does not make it legal. It's almost certain that he knows this, just like he knew that it was unconstitutional when he tried to renew unilaterally without an act of Congress the eviction moratorium that was promulgated by the CDC. The Supreme Court found that they did not have the authority, and the president didn't have the authority by working through that agency to promulgate that. And this is the exact same situation here. So it's illegal and it's unconstitutional. It's also unscientific. Now, we don't have the wording of his mandate yet, but nowhere in his speech did he mention natural immunity acquired from a prior infection. There are studies, one from Israel, that shows that if you have natural immunity from prior infection as a result of prior infection, that you are 27 times more protected than somebody who has taken 2 doses of the vaccine. And we're also finding that the vaccine is wearing off. They found that in Israel, and they're beginning to suggest boosters here. We don't have the text of his mandate yet, but presumably he'll have to change his mandate as soon as he issues his mandate if it doesn't also have the unproven need for the booster shot in it as well. So it's unscientific in that, so far as we know, it doesn't recognize natural immunity as a result of a prior infection. Finally, it's hurtful. This mandate will hurt our economy and it will hurt individuals. We have already seen one hospital in New York who's announced that they will quit delivering babies because they're having a staff shortage because nurses are leaving. I have constituents who have contacted me. These are women of childbearing age who have decided not to take the vaccine. Now, this is not particular to my district. Across the United States, demographically, women who are carrying a child have decided, more so than the rest of the population, not to take the vaccine. And there are many of them who will leave their positions in nursing and in teaching, and we will have a shortage because of this, as we are already seeing. And Joe Biden's mandate is basically a war on women, of working women of childbearing age, because they will be disproportionately affected by his mandate. Our economy will suffer. People will not be able to get the services they need that are being provided in industry, particularly the healthcare industry. So his mandate is illegal, unscientific, and hurtful, and I support Mr. McClintock's amendment, and I urge people to vote for it. I urge them to vote against Joe Biden's illegal, unconstitutional. If somebody thinks it's unconstitutional in this committee, or that it is constitutional or legal in this committee, I would love to hear them articulate that. And if they think it's fine to promulgate this mandate that is going to do more to discourage working women of childbearing age than anything that's ever been promulgated by the federal government, then I'd like to hear them explain how that's not going to happen. Or, you know, tell me that this isn't happening already, because we're already seeing news reports of it. Finally, if I may, I'd like to, in the few seconds that I have remaining, mention that this is unscientific in the context of the mandate that's being promulgated in the military, that they must get vaccinated. Again, it's unscientific because they don't recognize immunity from prior infection. And also the demographic that's highest at risk for myocarditis is males aged 19 to 24, which comprise the majority of our enlisted individuals in the military. So these mandates are hurtful, unscientific, and illogical and unconstitutional, and I support the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? For what purpose does Mr. Biggs seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support Mr. McClintock's amendment, and his amendment actually does nothing to impact the intervention strategies to reduce community violence in those entities that do that. In fact, it does the opposite, because the mandate that President Biden has issued is going to impact some of those entities that otherwise would be providing some of these services. Some people will leave because they don't want to get the vaccine, and you will have fewer providers potentially. It has all kinds of unintentional consequences, whereas what Mr. McClintock's amendment does that I think is so effective is that it prevents discrimination against those who oppose for whatever reason, but in particular that disfavor getting the vaccine. So that would mean that these entities that are providing the services that my colleagues are so concerned about would actually be protected more with this amendment. Without this amendment, you're going to see more difficulties arise in the community that provides these types of services that you have you've included in subtitle B, page 17 of the ANS. So with that, I think this proposed amendment is rational. I think it's strong, and I think it needs to be in here if you're going to protect the services providers that you want working in these areas. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yield?
I will yield to Mr. Bishop.
I thank the gentleman. I thought I'd elaborate just a moment a couple of things Mr. Biggs said and Mr. Massey said. Mr. Massey pointed out that what President Biden has done last Thursday is exactly the same playbook he used in the effort to extend a moratorium, which has transferred billions and billions of dollars of wealth from landlords in violation of their property rights. What Biden did in that case was, after the Supreme Court had, a majority of the Supreme Court had expressed the view that CDC had no such power to extend the moratorium, he did it anyway. He entered an order, and he acknowledged as he did so that he thought it was beyond his power. And that is, in itself, an abuse of power. What he's done in this instance with respect to all of the employers in the nation who employ over 100 people is to suggest that this CDC emergency standard authority extends not just to the workplace, which is what OSHA governs, but extends to regulating across the country a general matter of public health with a vaccine mandate that, let me make this clear. A vaccine mandate nationwide by the federal government has never in the history of this country been attempted. It is a gross abuse of power. It is an intrusion on the constitutional authority of this body, the Congress. And members of Congress should speak up to that and object to it rather than embracing it. But let this also be said. We do not have to wait for the emergence of the order from the Department of Labor to know whether damage has been done. Damage has occurred by Biden's threat. And that is why, to Mr. Johnson's point, we are hearing from employers all across the country who are mortified at the impact on their business. I had a number who are in the trades, in the construction trade, in the mechanical trade, HVAC contractors, who have worked hard to grow businesses in excess of 100 employees, and they compete with many, many competitors who have less than 100 employees.
Gentlemen, yield.
And they are concerned, I will in just a moment, and they are concerned, they are mortified that they are going to have drastic damage to their businesses because Americans will not knuckle under to a mandate from the President of the United States, who is to serve them, not command them. And with that, I would be glad to the lady.
It's my time. I control the
Mr.
time.
Biggs' time. I yield back.
Thank you. I would just want to catch on to those comments, because since President Biden's inflammatory speech, I know that my office, I know that me personally, any who know my cell phone, have been contacting me, employees as well as employers, employees who have told me they are leaving their employment because they do not want to take the vaccine. This is a disastrous policy, and Mr. Chairman, my time has expired.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Issa seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I know that none of our amendments are going to receive yours or any of the other majority's votes. I know that your instructions are simply to deliver the bill as it was delivered to you with no changes, because there's, in the view of many, a delicate balance on your side of the aisle that quite frankly, if you change it, you might lose some of your votes, and it's important that you keep it that way. And I think that risk is understood by us, that this is not something you were given. But I do think that in this case, recognizing that life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the adherence to the Constitution is in fact the mandate of this committee, that either this amendment and a series of others that seek to not change the underlying bill, but change some of the pushback on areas in which you yourself and other members that I've served with for so many years know are overreaches, represent at least an opportunity for this committee to go to its core, because at this committee's core, we are not a committee of anything if we are not a committee of protecting the Constitution. In the case of this amendment, the reason that I support it and the reason that I think it is so critical is that the executive order that it tries to limit, in fact, is easy to understand as being 1, an overreach, 2, unconstitutional, and 3, not seeking to, in fact, achieve a specific goal. As many of my colleagues have already said, it doesn't give any credit to those who have acquired natural immunity. It doesn't recognize that a vaccine now would represent nothing if, in fact, it isn't a vaccine every 6 months or so based on what's the emerging science. Will this lead to a vaccine for the flu being required? I might note that although smallpox was eradicated in our country and we no longer receive, our children no longer receive that vaccine, that it was never a mandate. No one's arm was ever stabbed against their will. And yet, we are not only planning to insist that you do this if you're going to keep your job, but as we speak, just 2 days from now, if we do not overturn all or part of some of these overreaches, the men and women of the United States military, including those who have risked their lives repetitively in Afghanistan and Iraq, will be involuntarily removed from service and a scar on their record if they refuse to put this new and somewhat unproven vaccine in their arm. Now, I personally, like Mr. McClintock, looked at the science, looked at it, and received my vaccines. But for people who have conditions that might concern them, for people who, for religious purposes, avoid all vaccines, the idea that we are mandating this, not when you're being deployed to a country, not on a specific requirement, but simply in order to retain a job that you may have honorably served in for 19 and a half years, and yet they're going to throw you out without your retirement if you refuse to take a vaccine that you believe you do not need and that might be harmful. So I know that there are a lot of amendments. I don't want to take more of the chairman's time and energy, but I do think that you should look at this and ask yourself, if you cannot accept this, what can you accept in order to maintain the legitimacy of this committee as the Committee of the Constitution? And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Buck seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I've been seeking recognition. I thought we went party to party.
Cohen wants. Mr. Cohen wants.
Mr. Buck has the floor.
Well, I'd like that next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to adopt the remarks of my friend, Mr. Massey, Mr. Biggs. I think it is really important that we understand that the fight against crime is an important fight and a fight that actually unites the Judiciary Committee. I know that my colleague from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and my colleague from Florida, Ms. Demings, have worked tirelessly on community programs that have sought to reduce crime. Mr. McClintock's amendment is a common sense amendment that seeks to make sure that we have the very best resources possible to fight crime, to help drug addicts who not only are drug addicts, but often seek money illegally to help them buy their drugs to satisfy their addiction, that help individuals who are in need of job training so that those individuals don't get frustrated and seek illegal ways of increasing their income, and all of the different strategies that are available to reduce crime, I think are so important that if we allow this vaccine mandate, this unconstitutional vaccine mandate that the president has talked about and has ordered his administration to implement, we are going to undermine the very necessary effort that unites this Judiciary Committee, the effort that will make sure that we reduce crime that is surging right now, crime that is surging as a result of really counterproductive policies like defunding the police, counterproductive policies like reducing prison cells and jail cells and reducing the mandatory minimums. All those policies that were put in place to reduce crime have now been thwarted, and to further undermine the efforts to reduce crime by allowing a vaccine mandate to prohibit the very best resources, the very best people to give these necessary job training, drug addiction counseling services to those in need, I think is counterproductive. And I would really ask my colleagues to look at Mr. McClintock's amendment in the spirit that it's offered, and to make sure that we are dealing with the crime issue in this country that is so important. I have more than a half dozen members of the military who have contacted my office and asked me to help them because they will not take the vaccine. One, a Navy pilot, actually I think a Marine pilot, who has received more than $1 million of training from the US government, will not take this vaccine, and he will be discharged as a result of that. How counterproductive is that? How absolutely insane is it that the best and brightest in our military are going to be discharged because of an unconstitutional and irrational policy? And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield to my friend from Texas, Mr. Roy.
Thank my friend from Colorado. I'm not in DC because I had previous engagements set up in Texas dealing with our border. Now, I'm going to talk about that separately when we deal with some amendments regarding the border. That's why I stayed in Texas, because of ranchers and people that are getting directly impacted by wide open borders. Fentanyl pouring into our communities in San Antonio and Austin, Texas. But here we sit, $107 billion, completely unable to know exactly how that's going to be spent based on the documents I'm currently looking at, but knowing it's money that we don't have, that this is kabuki theater, and that the American people are sitting back in their homes and they're looking at their leadership in Congress and just wondering what in the hell it is they're doing. Going to Washington, D.C. to have this meeting to spend $107 billion we don't have. I'm going to take some time in a minute. I raise my hand on my own time to talk about the unconstitutionality and unlawfulness of this executive order, because that's what this is about. And I wholeheartedly co-sponsor the comments of my friend from Colorado, my friend from Kentucky, my friend from California, Mr. McClintock. And I'll jump back in when I get my time.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes Mr. Cohen seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman's briefly.
Thank you. I will not take all 5. I appreciated Mr. McClintock's remarks. He brought Benjamin Franklin to our attention. Benjamin Franklin and my father had something in common, unfortunately. Benjamin Franklin chose back in the early 1700s not to inoculate his young child, who was 4 years of age, with the smallpox vaccine. His child died. He regretted that decision the rest of his life, and he wished he'd have had him inoculated. And Benjamin Franklin, who was a man of science, changed his position on inoculations and vaccines. My father was a physician. He gave the Salk vaccine during its experimental stages in 1954 to second grade students in Memphis, Tennessee. They were given to second grade students around the country as a trial. He thought about taking some vaccine home to give to me. He had given the vaccine to my older brother, who was in the second grade at Idlewild Elementary School. Because it was outside of his protocol, he did not take the vaccine home, which he easily could have done and given me a shot, because it was outside his protocol. He did the right professional thing. And 4 months later, I came down with polio. It affected me for the next 3 months when I was in the hospital and the following year when I was on crutches. It's affected me all of my life, and many of you know I limp and have trouble standing because of polio and post-polio, which I suffer from now. My father, like Benjamin Franklin, regretted the rest of his life for not having given me a polio shot. I am a strong proponent of vaccinations. Every state in our nation requires children to have vaccinations of many kinds, and nobody objects. President Biden is authorized by law to mandate vaccinations in a public emergency. And if it's going to be questioned in the courts, it will be, and that will determine whether it's constitutional or not. But from a public safety perspective, I think President Biden is doing the right thing. And I, as someone who suffered from not having a vaccination when it was available and became available to all in 1955 and have suffered from it, felt it necessary to make these remarks to encourage everybody to take a shot. Not, as one of our members said, to have a substance put in their arm, but to have a medication put in their arm that will save them, their neighbors, their loved ones from possibly getting coronavirus and dying. Our hospitals are full. The expense is great. People are not getting services in the ICU because people are in there because of COVID. And we need to get through a pandemic. I urge the defeat of this amendment and all Americans to get vaccinated, to wear masks, to defeat this pandemic. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes does Mr. Tiffany seek recognition?
To move this, strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, with this First Amendment, we can stop the erosion of trust that is going on with our federal government. And it could start right here in the House of Representatives, specifically with the Judiciary Committee, by not putting out these mixed messages as the Biden administration has. Remember, as the ranking member said, President Biden said he was not going to issue a vaccine mandate. It was echoed by his press secretary. And the Speaker of this House of Representatives said the same thing. We don't have the power to mandate a vaccine. It confuses the American people, which has been going on for over a year and a half with the so-called head of the coronavirus actions for our federal government, Dr. Fauci. People are so confused because they hear mixed messages that come out from the same people's lips day after day. And President Biden just did that. He said he was not going to issue a vaccine mandate, and then he turns around and does it. But here's the question I'm getting from a number of my constituents. People who use the VA, the Veterans Administration, they're saying, are they going to stop me from being able to get care if I do not get the vaccine? Social Security recipients comes from the federal government. Are we going to be prevented from getting our earned compensation from Social Security that we put together over our working lives? Is Medicare going to go away if we do not take the vaccine? Because they're seeing this steadily ratchet up. As my colleague from Kentucky has said so many times, a mask mandate is going to beget a vaccine mandate. And he has been so prescient on that issue. I just want to close with this. The gentleman who's offering this amendment spoke very eloquently about it, and he used the term liberty. And I think it's very important to remember that term as it was used at the founding, because the founders used it as often as they used the term freedom, because I think everyone in this room and on this committee truly believes in freedom, but liberty is different. Liberty is a coin, and on one side of that coin is stamped freedom, and we all believe in it. But for a coin to be of value, it has to be stamped on the other side. And the other side of that coin, we call liberty, is called responsibility, accountability for your actions. And that's what the founders believed in. We just heard from the gentleman from Tennessee about Benjamin Franklin, that he may have had regrets in regards to one of his children But I can guarantee you Benjamin Franklin never had a regret about defending liberty. Because he knew ultimately, even if an individual makes the wrong choice, as sometimes happens, as the gentleman from California alluded to, we are always better off as Americans when we protect liberty. I urge everyone to support this amendment that has been put forward by the gentleman from California, and I yield.
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
I will yield for a moment.
I'm not a great student of history, but I try. In your recollection, isn't it true that Ben Franklin's vaccine that the gentleman from Tennessee referred to was in fact simply a live infection at the time, that they didn't have vaccines, but rather they scraped the pox of people and infected in order to get what was hoped to be a minor case. It wasn't a vaccine, it was in fact natural immunity that they sought, that Mr. Cohen now is willing to ignore in this legislation, the 41 million people who have acquired natural immunity.
So that certainly could be the case. I have not studied in depth exactly how that worked back in the 1700s, but we certainly know.
I'm older than you. I remember it vividly.
Yeah, but we certainly know that Benjamin Franklin believed in the liberty of the people of the United States, and it led to, as the founder, one of the greatest country in the history of mankind. And that came about as a result of us having our personal liberties. And if Franklin was here today, I'm sure he would say, let's protect liberty first, because prosperity and health will come from that liberty being protected. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes, Mr. Royce seek recognition?
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank the chairman. I alluded earlier to the fact that I'm not in Washington because I believed it important to stay in Texas to meet with constituents of mine who are suffering the ravages of an open border. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But it's real. I always get the smirks and the laughter from some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle when we talk about this issue. But what I'll say is on this particular point, the gentleman from Kentucky has left his chair. I don't know if he's in earshot, but I take to heart what he has pointed out about the impact of polio. My dad had polio, got it in 1949, before the Salk vaccine. I'm sitting here on my front porch. You can see a tractor over my shoulder. Just yesterday, I was out there working on that with my dad. He's 78. He has a tracheostomy now because of post-polio syndrome. Same thing the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Cohen, was just referencing. So I know post-polio syndrome. I know polio. It has made my dad very unable to walk, barely get around today. And I understand the importance of vaccines. I gave polio vaccine to my children. I took the polio vaccine. We're blessed to be able to do that. But there were many, many years that led to that. Many, many years that led to the decision that local governments under the power of our Constitution, left to them to make that decision, so that the people most close to their government can make a decision about something as invasive as a shot, as something as Mr. Cohen just sort of briefly pushed aside. Oh, it's medicine. But through the all-knowing power of those on this committee, we know what you must put in your arm, regardless of whether you have natural immunity. We are talking about the foundations of our country, y'all. We have nothing left. We have nothing left if we are not able to make decisions for our loved ones, our families, and ourselves without the power of government stepping in from Washington, D.C. to tell us what we will do about our loved ones. I want to be very clear. I co-sponsor the remarks of my colleagues that have said this is unlawful, unconstitutional. The president does not have the authority to do this. Let me be also clear. I don't need the Article 3 Judiciary branch to tell me yay or nay on that question. The fact of the matter is, the President of the United States does not have this power. And I am saying to all of my constituents, to the governor of Texas, Do not follow this executive order. Do not fear the power of the federal government. Stand up along your neighbors, your communities, your friends, and say no. If you're in a small business in Texas or anywhere else in this country, don't believe you have to listen to an unconstitutional, unlawful order from the President of the United States. You do not. And governors in states, stand up and say no. I support this amendment. We're going to try to operate within this structure, but I want to be very clear that there is no basis in law for this, and we're not going to follow it. I, for one, am never going to tell any of you or tell anybody else whether I've had this vaccine or not. It's none of your damned business. You're not going to know. I'm standing on that wall, and I'm going to stand on that wall for my constituents. And I mean stand on that wall. This isn't going to happen. I'm not going to listen to the President of the United States violate the Constitution to then interfere with my family and my loved ones. My 12-year-old son is my call, Mr. Cohen. We will make that decision, my wife and I. No one else, and certainly no one in Washington, D.C. We will work together in the people of our community. We will follow the structure of the government that we've fought for over 250 years to ensure that no one individual has the power to step over liberty. That is what is at stake here today. I can go through all the information that my colleague from Kentucky, Mr. Massey, and others have gone through about natural immunity. We haven't talked about all of the various treatments that are being ignored by the federal government, prohibiting Americans from being able to access monoclonal antibodies, the ivermectin, the HCQ, and all the things that are out there that it's at least possible for others to use, and the federal government standing in the way of that. We can talk about that, but I want to be clear in my last 7 seconds. I will not tell you whether I'm getting the vaccine, and I will defend my constituents to the wall that they don't have to do it either. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question occurs on the amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition?
Bishop.
For what purposes does Mr. Bishop seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought there were a couple of other points that ought to be made before we vote. I made the point earlier in someone else's time that this is following immediately on the heels of the unconstitutional attempt to extend the eviction moratorium by executive decree. This is an abuse of power that we're talking about. The vaccine mandate that President Biden has threatened is an abuse of power, but it also is an abuse of trust. Before he was elected president, Biden said he would not mandate the use of vaccines or the administration of vaccines. The CDC director has said in recent months that there would be no mandate. And from the White House podium, the White House press secretary said it isn't the role of the federal government to mandate vaccine administration across the nation. So what the administration has said over and over again, including most importantly what the president said before he was elected, he is betraying. And the American people are damaged by that, in addition to the abuse of power that I described. And I think the gentleman from Tennessee has inspired this thought. There's also a disrespect of the American people in the attempt to deny them the dignity of their own judgment. And worse, it would appear that the administration intends to substitute a judgment that is faulty. The president said in his remarks on Thursday that he intends to protect the vaccinated from the unvaccinated. Doesn't that say it all? What is the subtext there? President Biden and his administration lacks confidence in the efficacy of vaccines. Otherwise, the vaccinated need no protection from the unvaccinated. And to the gentleman's comment from Tennessee, your father in the story that you related, made a judgment. He made a judgment in good faith and based on the circumstances as he knew them. The outcome of the judgment does not defeat the value of the prerogative, the freedom to make judgments by the American people. Here, Biden has undertaken an abuse of his power, an abuse of his trust, to lay down the threat of a rule that will suspend or deprive the American people of their judgment to make the best call in the innumerably different circumstances they may face. The best example of all, to me, is the question of one who's been infected with COVID, suffered COVID, and has recovered, and whose immunity, even Dr. Fauci said on TV in response to a question on CNN the other day, he cannot give a straightforward answer. He cannot offer assurances, unqualified assurances, that natural immunity is not better. He cannot offer assurances, and Mr. Cohen, it's not my call, it's my son's 21-year-old son's call, but he's had COVID. And he's decided, he's one of those that we hear about who are having myocarditis, the young men in particular who are receiving vaccines after having COVID. And so if he makes a judgment, even if the judgment turns out to be mistaken, that is what this country is all about. That's what freedom is all about. And we need to make sure we stand in front of those who would so easily dispense with freedom based on one event in their past or one example that they believe overrides all others. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? No?
No.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Chairman?
The amendment,
Mr. Chairman, on that, I'd ask for a recorded vote.
the yeas and nays are requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass?
No.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries?
No.
Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell?
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu?
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal?
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Stimmings?
No.
Ms. Stimmings votes no. Mr. Correa?
No.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath?
No.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones?
No.
Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross?
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat?
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Issa?
Aye.
Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Buck?
Aye.
Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates?
Aye. Aye.
Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock?
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stubbe?
Yes.
Mr. Stubbe votes yes. Mr. Tiffany?
Aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey?
Aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye.
aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy?
Aye.
Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop?
Yes.
Mr. Bishop votes yes. Ms. Fishbach?
Fishbach votes yes.
Ms. Fishbach votes yes. Ms. Sparts?
Art, yes.
Ms. Sparts votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald?
Aye.
Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Bentz?
Yes.
Mr. Bentz votes yes. Mr. Owens?
Owens, aye.
Mr. Owens votes aye.
How am I recorded? This is
Mr.
Congressman
Cohen?
Mr. Cohen, you're,
I'd like to be recorded as no.
Mr. Cohen votes no.
Thank you.
Are there any other amendments who haven't voted who wish to vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 19 ayes and 24 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have
This is Mr. Issa seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the
I
amendment.
reserve a point of